Hello everyone, in today's video we're going to be answering a question I get from time to time, and that is, when should you use your autopilots? And this is one of those things where I'm like, why, kind of a surprise if that makes sense. So the reason this is an important question is in the real world, when I do fly, I do have access. Every aircraft that I fly has an automatic pilot on it, and people often say, okay, when do you turn it on? When do you turn it off? Like, is it something you have on all the time? Is it something that you use for different components? And for me, and I think this is a critical component, and I'll show you exactly what I mean here. The autopilot is there to hold the wheel. It's there to basically knock out some of the workload for you as a pilot. So whenever you're in situations where your workload is high, that would be the ultimate time to turn on the automatic pilot. So what I've done here is I've created myself a really, really nasty rainy scenario. And the reason I've chosen, other than the fact it's raining today, is the fact that this gives us a great opportunity to show you what I mean by that. So right now we have ourselves talking to air traffic control, and that's going to be always kind of fun because then what we're going to do is we're going to design ourselves to help reduce that workload. And one of the big mistakes people make is the fact that they'll not have everything set up, or there'll be a sudden change that requires them to basically fiddle with things, and next thing you know, we're flying into the side of the ground. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and get this aircraft airborne and pretend that, we know that we need to be, like, let's say we need to go due west or something. So let's go ahead and give it full power here. Get rolling down the runway. Oh my gosh, I'm not a fan of rain takeoffs at all. So what they don't tell you about rain is how loud it is. And that's one thing flight sims do an okay job of, but until you've driven through like real rain, it's just like for basically, and it's deafening, like positively, absolutely deafening there. All right, let's go ahead and get airborne. We don't have any runway remaining in a moment. Good enough. And just like that, we're airborne. Of course, all of our good instrument flying skills that kick in right away here. A little bit of right foot versus Bonanza. So then people go, okay, so this is pretty good. I can do this all afternoon. I'm doing my initial climb out here. I'm getting bounced around, looking pretty good. And then you go ahead and start your general turn towards, like I said, we're going to west today. So we'll go ahead and start the turn to the west. Let's go ahead and do some quick work here. We'll back up RPM to a better, kind of a climb RPM. This is a Bonanza after all. If you're driving a Bonanza, chances are you probably want to be careful with it. Pull ourselves to the right a little bit there. Getting a little over bank. There's our west. Pop that. Give it a couple taps of down trim because it's going to want to run on us as soon as we do it. And now we're on our way to the west. So again, all those things were relatively straightforward. I didn't have to stress out too much. I had my trim all preset. And notice at any point, I didn't feel the need to go reaching for the automatic pilot. Then things start to get complicated. We get a call from air traffic control. They say, proceed direct XYZ or something along those lines. As I like to say, that's where the fun starts. So you're like, oh, okay, they want us to take head due north here, 360. All right, 360, no problem. Then they say level off at 2,500. Okay, then we have to level off at 2,500. Then they call us back and say, actually, take a right turn to 090. And now I'm still doing my climbing, and I'm at 2,500 feet, and I've got my hands kind of busy because that turbulence is setting. And all of a sudden, the workload spikes. Because then they call you and say, contact Bradley approach on 127.8. And then you're traveling to the north, and then you were traveling to the east, and we're trying to get to 2,500 feet. And then you run yourselves into these fun little nightmare scenarios, which get very, very challenging very, very quickly. This is when automatic pilot is your best friend. So I'm going to go ahead and snap on my automatic pilot right away. You'll notice it's on roll hold, so it's actually holding my wheel for me right now. Now, the reason that's so useful is I can come over here and actually snap on altitude hold while that's going. And then while I'm getting myself set up to this due east, I can actually do a heading sync just like that, and then I can actually flip on my heading hold mode and lock everything out that quickly. So now I can concentrate on saying 127.8 right. So now everything is being held for me, and it's giving me the ability to actually go ahead and get what I need. So what I say, 127.8, I'll come over here, 127, 12, just like that. Keep in mind, this is COM 2, not COM 1. So actually, I'm sorry, COM 1, I'm good. Bradley approach, Red 64 is 2,500, heading east, direct XYZ or something along those lines. So in that case, the automatic pilot was basically there to hold the wheel for me as I started addressing some of the other flying needs of the airplane. Now, one of the things that's going to be critical with is going to be any time I'm doing any sort of takeoff, any time I'm doing any sort of approach to any sort of a landing. Now, of course, you probably observe the fact that I'm not actually at 2,500 feet. I've actually called for 2,550, which is okay. But notice I wasn't wasting time trying to get these numbers perfect when I could just quickly hit that button to go ahead and synchronize everything for me for the purposes of flying. Now, let's say they call me back and say, climb and maintain a flight level. Or, well, I would be, if we're doing a flight level, we got a real serious situation there. Climb to 5,000 feet, proceed direct XYZ. Okay, so I'm going to do everything one at a time here. So go ahead and select here. I'll do vertical speed. That looks pretty good to me. Nose up. We'll get 500 feet per minute is perfectly acceptable. And then they said, let's say proceed direct. Let's do a VOR. Let's do a ORW. So I just come in here, and now that climb is going. And again, as I'm trying to work out these individual controls, these things are really, really difficult to operate in turbulence. And one of the things that we get a little bit of in flight sim is that simulation. So OR, let's see, we're going to do Norwich. ORW. And we'll go ahead and get ORZ. And notice again, enter. There we go. So now we can flip over to navigation mode. And because I had everything kind of set that way, even though they were throwing all that stuff at us back to back, at no point was I losing control of the aircraft. I still had maintenance. I was still able to sit here and do the kind of fiddle with the dials while the aircraft was under my, basically the automatic pilot's control. And that to me is the best part of autopilot. It's not flying for you. It's grabbing the wheel when things get really, really intense. Now, when we're coming in for a landing, you get a similar kind of situation of overwhelming information. Now we're getting ourselves set up for an instrument approach. Now, when you're just flying point A to point B, one of the nice things that Autopilot does for you is that, again, the concept of holding that wheel. But one of the things is that I found from flying these aircraft, at least small general aviation airplanes, is a lot of times you hit certain maneuvers where it's just simpler to do it by hand than it is to actually have the automatic pilot basically step in there for you. And one of the classic examples I always think of are things like our procedure turns here. You can see in a few moments that we're going to be coming up here, so everything's all nice and set to go. I'm actually going to go ahead and disengage the automatic pilot here. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to fly ourselves a pretty standard procedure turn. Now, one of the problems they always have with these types of turns that you're going to see when you're operating them in the real world is the fact that a lot of times your autopilot is not going to be sensitive enough to do it carefully. So one of the things you get is as you're getting all your angles all set up and everything kind of prepared for it, you actually find that jumping in here and doing it by hand is just going to be a lot smoother experience than with the aircraft or especially the GPS is going to be setting. The other problem, of course, we have during critical phases like we have here when we're doing an instrument approach is the fact that you're going to be doing a lot of knob twisting. And one of the dangers of all knob twisting is if you grab onto the one that's controlling the current direction and altitude of your aircraft, you could start having yourselves some trouble. So now that I've got myself basically flying this little procedure turn, getting ready for my little reversal into Kibbe here, I can actually go ahead and start doing some knob twisting, getting everything ready to go. So looking in, I'll zoom in a little bit, make this a little bit simpler. We're executing our right turn. One thing we have to do, of course, is switch to localizer mode. That's going to be pretty critical for us here. And now we're going to go ahead and execute our nice gentle turn here. I can actually give it a little bit more turns as we start to go head over to the point where we're going to start our approach, our hold itself. You can see we just cut across there. But this is our standard rate turn that we want to be using for the purposes of doing any sort of piece here in instrument flying. So again, I'm just going to enjoy my standard rate as I come flipping around here. Our automatic pilot, if we let this thing kind of do this component, like I said, it's going to be a little bit slow, especially a lot of the default autopilots. So you want to kind of be mindful of that. And again, we're just going to come around here. Hold the nose just slightly over the horizon there. We've got no glide slope information just yet. Just kind of continue that swing around. Oh, getting a little bit much. Go ahead and bring it back that way. Again, this is all by hand. Now, one of the things that makes this very challenging in the real world, of course, is, again, that air traffic control component. You know, they're going to be calling you constantly saying intercept the localizer, and you're going to be like, intercept the localizer, proceed data, maintain this altitude until that particular point. All those things are going to be whacked at you almost instantaneously. Let's go ahead and pull that out. We'll go ahead and level a little aircraft down. It was a little tiny bit of altitude, but it's a bonanza. Well, even. And you can see there we have ourselves pretty well established, ready to go. One big mistake I noticed with folks with autopilot is they try to get the autopilot to fly everything for them. And while an autopilot can do that, it works best, especially for your passengers, when you're in a situation where you're utilizing the autopilot for the purposes of basically, like I showed you earlier, is you kind of hand off the responsibility to the autopilot after everything's been nice and neatly configured and they're ready to go. So here we are, or basically, if I come take a look to my right here, you can see that we're basically going to have to come snapping over here to the left, and we're going to get ready for our actual approach down to the ground here. So I'm going to go ahead and just sort of intercept that. And again, this is how you'd be calling your traffic control about 500 times here. It looks pretty good. I'll hold it right there. We got a bit of a wind today, so thank you, Flight Sim. I actually appreciate this little default. It's a little on the nosy as far as wind speed and wind direction, at least in this region. So now we have ourselves pretty much ready to go. And now, of course, once we're all kind of established and we get ready for that glide slope component, we can now get everything else nice and smooth and ready to go before we hand it back off to the automatic pilot. And again, that's an important component of all of this. It's very, very, very tempting to snap onto approach mode and just let this thing start sinking. But the downside to that, and I really can't emphasize this enough, is that that's going to give you all sorts of stability problems when you finally do engage it. So I'm going to go ahead and get this aircraft ready for landing here. We'll go ahead and kind of do our initial checks, kind of get the last couple components ready to go. One thing we can do is we do have a flight director, which is a super duper handy tool if we tell it what we want to do. So if I actually flip on approach hold mode, our actual little flight director, that's a little pink bar, will actually help us start to fly the approach downward. But the reason I want to do it by hand initially is because I want to go ahead and get the aircraft all ready to go for its actual approach before we get to that component. Go ahead and I'll pull that back there and I start slowing ourselves down. One of the mistakes everybody makes with these high performance planes is they forget you do have to slow down before you land the plane, which is kind of one of those fun things people forget. Or it's one of those things that they remember, but they just don't take very seriously. I'll get to about 15 inches, especially in a Bonanza. I think it's 16 or 17 inches is roughly what your approach power is going to be. Now notice we're starting to slow down here. Notice everything's looking pretty darn good, but we're in a really good spot here. We can actually start to think about getting our gear down. We can also start thinking about getting everything else down. The other thing too is our trim is set properly. Remember, automatic pilot needs trim in order to operate. So that looks basically beautiful right there. So I'm going to snap on the AP, and now I'm going to continue setting up the rest of the aircraft for our landing. Get our first click of flaps in. We're going to go ahead and engage the gear. We're under a gear speed there. Now notice our aircraft is going to stably transition between that little level flight as we got the plane nice and dirty at the same time as it begins its descent down onto the actual glide slope. You see how we've engaged glide slope here, but the other thing you probably observed is we're basically a perfect speed here for the purposes of our little descent here. So now as the aircraft starts to nose over, because we had everything set up and because everything was ready to go before we began that component, we get a very, very smooth transition that brings us back down to the ground very, very safely. Now, I will say for the record, autopilots are fantastic at flying approaches. You know, you might be good at flying an approach, but a really well-tuned autopilot is just, it's godlike. Like, it's unbelievable how stable it is on approach. However, the turbulence is bad enough. Your aircraft's approach autopilot will boom, and all of a sudden snap you off. And guess whose responsibility it is to take over the control of that approach at any point during it. So it's really, 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 really critical that you keep your hands right on that yoke ready to go, because in the real world, autopilot pops off all the time. So one of the things you got to watch out for is the fact that you might have to do this manually all of a sudden. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and speed up time here, and then we'll show you the last component of the autopilot and approach here that people kind of miss. So again, we'll enjoy a nice little long descent across the Connecticut River there in just a few moments. Gotta love the bounces, gotta love the bumps. It's the most fun part of flying. Nice and relaxed. Notice, by the way, how low our airspeed started getting there. It did not take much. Go ahead and give it a power. We're about an 85 knot approach speed, so I'll get it just a little bit slower. And again, if you didn't get everything nice and smooth before you started engaging the autopilot, you're going to start playing the game with it. And that's going to be as you desperately try to get everything nice and smooth and ready to go. Again, it's one of those lessons that people miss with these, so you have to be really, really mindful of that. There's the wind shift. I love this full speed here. Go ahead and slow that back down, and I can see the runway. So people now say, when should we take back over? And again, I'm coming in for an approach here. Everything's looking pretty smooth. I think we're still time accelerated. Nope, we're good. When do I take over? Well, I usually like to take over before minimums. And as you can see, we actually went past minimums on this particular approach. So if we were going to fly this one, we wanted to do it. Now, if you're in a big, big, big heavy airliner, one of the problems people often face with their aircraft is the fact that the moment you disengage autopilot, a bunch of things happen. Your trim will suddenly change. all your different settings will change, and all of a sudden you'll be fighting the controls. So you really ideally want to be doing that sooner rather than later in order to make it a little bit easier to actually control the aircraft itself. So you can see we got ourselves back down to the ground here to give this thing a pretty hefty amount of right aileron here. What kind of happens, but again, control. But you can see exactly where I use the autopilot and kind of when. Now, there are different philosophies. Obviously, when you deal with airliners, things are going to change because you have a different speed involved, and you also have a different level of stability. But as a general rule, when it comes to the landing part and the takeoff part, if you can see, use the autopilot to kind of hold the wheel for you. Enjoy.